I should say that I'm going to give two talks in one. Let's imagine it like The Office. Sometimes I'll be talking directly to the camera, saying what I'm really thinking. The rest of the time I'll be acting. So you'll be able to tell which time I'm doing what as when I'm talking to you. So if you're confused out there, that's because there's two plays going on here. Yeah. Now, you have the questions that we've suggested, and we can talk about the thinking behind those when we're together or anytime you want to. Scholars and teachers already know how to run discussions, so my colleagues here who do this for a living, you'll excuse me for telling you how I would do it. I know you have your own thoughts about this, your own strategies and skills for doing that. As Fran reminds us, these are adults and they can say anything they want, and they will, and that will be fun. But for that reason, I think it's really important that we focus on the text in front of us. That people can say what they want, but look, I think a skillful strategy that we'll need to deploy is, that's interesting. How would you see that reflected in what we actually read for today? Because everybody does have an opinion about a lot of these things, but people probably have not read Frederick Douglass's speech or Henry David Thoreau's, and so it's fine for them. And there's not an agenda to this. I mean, there's not a hidden strategy of trying to brainwash people into feeling exactly the same way that we might. Now, the selections, we might remind people, cover the United States from upstate New York and Massachusetts, down through Virginia to Louisiana, all the way out to Missouri. So there's a broad chronological, in South Carolina, Alexander Steve. So there's a broad chronological, geographic range in these kinds of readings. And frankly, too, if we translate it to today's terms, it represents the ideological spectrum from the far left to the far right. And so it might seem to some people that there's been a gotcha in assigning Alexander Stevens or talking about Robert E. Lee's decisions, but there is not. This is the Vice President of the Confederacy. We'll talk about that a little bit. So this is meant to represent the range of what people actually said. Now, if there's somebody left out of this, ironically, it's Northern Democrats. It's the majority that dominated the North for decades, and it's also moderate Southerners, white Southerners, who are trying to figure out what to do. So if you were going to make a criticism, and I think it's a perfectly good thing, it's not going to hurt my feelings for people to talk about why these readings, what's left out, and so forth, because, as I admitted yesterday, there's more left out than there is included. But it's not slanted in the sense, it's strong statements, is that there's a bias here, rather than people doing what they normally do, what we all do. I don't know what to think about those debates last night, or, gosh, what's he thinking about this? That's what most people think most of the time. It doesn't really make for an interesting discussion. So, but people need to understand that the unrepresented group here is the audience to which everybody else is speaking. They're all either mad at that big majority, or they're trying to motivate that big majority. They're trying to get them to think about either not seceding or seceding. They're trying to get them to think about how would you get them to fight against fellow Americans. So as you look at all of this, imagine the audience that is out there. And the audience is the great majority of Americans who are trying to figure out, where in the world do I fit in all this? So I thought perhaps the value added I could provide this morning would be to give you a glimpse of some of the thinking behind these selections, a bit of context. Now, people understand that talking about a novel, what that means, because it's like a book group, but as we said yesterday, they're not so sure about how you talk about 9 readings. And that's something else to think about, that this time will fly by, not like when I'm talking to you, when you wonder if I'll ever shut up, but when you're doing it, it'll be fun. And I think anybody who's a skilled teacher, an experienced teacher, knows that if you don't cover all the material, people feel really cheated. I spent all that time reading that last reading, so you need to make sure that from the beginning that you're acknowledging an entire range of readings. You refer to it in passing, but you also leave yourself enough time to make sure that you address all of it. Because if you want people to come back the next week and be active participants, they need to feel that that half hour that they spent puzzling over that thing is actually going to be rewarded. So that's one thing that I would think. And so it's also important, I think, to be weaving connections back into what they'd read in previous weeks, and even foreshadowing a little bit what they're going to be doing to suggest that these things all connect. So let's plunge in. I might begin by asking why this anthology would begin with 5 speeches of all things. People generally don't like to hear speeches that much anymore, even when we have debates. We call them debates, not speeches. People are ready to change the channels very quickly. Why would they do that? And the idea is to remind people that these were matters of heated public debate. These weren't just opinions that people had, but these were things at play in the world, in the United States of that time. But it was not always recognized as such. Now, we'll talk about, I'm going to show a couple of things this morning, and one of the things I'm showing here is what American politics looks like in 1840. And we'll play this, it's a movie, and we'll play it to the time of the war. One thing you'll notice is that you'd be hard-pressed to see American regions here. Where's slavery reflected on this? The blue counties are Democrats, the yellow are Whig. And it looks like American politics in 1840 is very well distributed. There's some division that we can't see that's not north and south. Okay? So I banish the word antebellum from any conversation that I have by doing just this. It's always antebellum. It's always sometime before a war. We just don't know when the war is coming. And we do not organize our life around a war that we don't know is coming, and neither did Americans. They didn't go, here we are in the antebellum period, only 20 years until the war. But you might think that. I sometimes quote in Ken Burns' series, he actually has a line that he'll call, and then events speeded up. No, they didn't. You're speeding it up to get to the war. Instead, during long periods of time, there's nothing happening that looks like it's leading to the Civil War. In the 1850s, in the periods in between the readings we're doing today, the hot topics people are really mad at are the Catholics, the immigrants. They're going to ruin America. Or the gold rush, or the silver rush, or the American Indians, or Mormonism. Those are the things that are getting a lot of attention in the press. And ironically, one of the best ways we can end the Civil War is forget about it, that it's coming. Because you'll notice a long time passes between Frederick Douglass's speech and Henry David Thoreau's. A lot of 8 years are going by. And people need to remember that people are living their lives. In that session we had at the University of Richmond, Gary Gallagher had a great line. He says, people did not wake up every morning and go, what do I think about the sectional crisis today? And he also points out that 98% of the people who live in the North are white before the Civil War, right? And so they're not thinking very much, frankly, about the plight of the 4 million people held in slavery. So that's one reason for all the energy you hear in Frederick Douglass and in Henry David Thoreau is because most white Northerners are not thinking about these issues. Now, they're ready to be, we'll talk about what they were thinking about, but I think the desperation and frustration that you hear in talks like Douglass and Thoreau is precisely because they were an extreme minority. You notice, I think, that Thoreau says, in every town across the North, there are 2 or 3 people who feel this way. Okay? That's an important thing. It might be something you point out to your readers. Because that means that about 2% of white Northerners would have identified themselves as abolitionists. Yeah, 2%. Okay? And it would have been in every county. There were people who looked into their souls and read the New Testament and said slavery is an abomination. But most people would not have thought that. And we need to remember that the Democrats were the dominant party throughout this entire period. We'll see this in a little while too. So it's important that people have a sense of proportion about all that. It's like every northern community that I've seen had a house that was on the Underground Railroad in their imaginations, right? And everybody imagines that they would have been an abolitionist, or they would have been against slavery, at least, but the fact is that most people were not. I sometimes use the analogy, we can imagine in 30 years that people are going to be appalled to look back and people used to raise animals and kill them to eat, which I do. Okay, so this is not a hidden political message. We have all the information to know why vegetarianism might make sense, and yet we don't act on it, right? The context is not there that we actually act on it. So people could know that slavery was wrong, but one of the questions we asked here is, what if you agreed with Frederick Douglass? What are you going to do about it? What if you agreed with Henry David Thoreau? What are you going to do about it? So that's an important thing for people to remember as well, that that everything is not oriented around this, and ironically, that's one reason the Civil War comes. So let's think back about the context of Douglas's speech. And I should say right here that the history that you need to know to set the context for these things really isn't Wikipedia, right? It's like what was the context of the Compromise of 1850, for example, right? Well, most people don't have that memorized. But what you need to recognize that Douglas is talking 18 months after the Compromise of 1850. And what you might want to think about, why would he be so furious and despairing, is that Texas has just entered the Union, a vast slave state. And that in part of a compromise, which also said that California would never be a slave state, however, it implicates the North in the fugitive slave law. Okay? So you'll see Lincoln refer to that in his speech. And it's at the very time that Douglas is speaking that Harriet Beecher Stowe is starting to publish Uncle Tom's Cabin, serially, 1851. It comes out in the year of Douglas's speech. As a result, also of a sense that they're losing, because you still have slavery in the District of Columbia. You still have the Fugitive Slave Act in which white Northerners are being implicated in sustaining slavery.